Here at Midway Christian Church, creation care is a part of how we live our faith. Protecting God's creation means protecting our brothers and sisters everywhere. We all deserve clean air, clean water, and a thriving world around us. It's by coming together that we can do extraordinary, positive things for our children, our congregation, and our community, and create a healthier, safer climate and a more equitable world for ourselves and future generations. At Midway Christian Church, we're living out a legacy of love. Won't you join us at the table?
As members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we are called to be God's hands in the world. Whether it's caring for our neighbors, protecting our children, or seeking justice for the most vulnerable among us, it's our duty to go out in the world and change it for the better. Get involved with ELCA's creation care programs. Talk about climate change with your families, friends, colleagues, and local congregations. And inspire others to do what they can to protect our climate and this world that we call home. Please join us.
Greetings and gratitude to everyone watching today. I'm Annie Fête Cruz, the director of ecoAmerica's Blessed Tomorrow program, which is a coalition of faith institutions who are acting on our collective moral responsibility to care for the world by catalyzing action and advocacy on climate solutions. But first, before we get started, I want to talk to those participating today who are not here because they are faith leaders or connected with Blessed Tomorrow. You might ask a natural question, why are we hearing from faith leaders on climate today? And I use this exercise often. If you think about your community and your pre-COVID commute to work or to the grocery store, picture the many places of worship that you pass. Nearly every community has one or 100. And collectively, these faith communities bring together tens of millions of Americans all around the country every week, all commonly rooted in a stated moral responsibility to serve and care for others and the earth. So in addition, faith communities play influential roles at the local, national, and international levels on policies and with decision-making bodies. So we believe faith communities must play an important role in bearing witness to the impacts and to the grief of climate change, and that we can model and drive the change we need for climate solutions at the pace and scale that Bill McKibben spoke about earlier. We're going to talk about this in today's session. So I am honored to be joined by my distinguished guests, the Reverend Michael Malcom, founder of the People's Justice Council and executive director of Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, and an American Climate Leadership Summit scholar. The Reverend Dr. Leah Schade, professor at Lexington Theological Seminary, and author of several books, including Preaching in the Purple Zone, Ministry in the Red-Blue Divide, and Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in a Time of Climate Crisis. And also the Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer, General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ, who's leading the UCC forward on many priorities, including environmental justice. So please check out the Action Center on the right side of your screen. We will be issuing a poll here. If you toggle over, you can take that now. We'll look at our responses in just a moment. And don't forget to engage with us on social media at hashtag ACLS2020Live. So welcome everyone. First, I want to ask you the same question that we're asking our audience here. We know that this is a time when a lot of us are experiencing what some call eco-anxiety, and it's being compounded by the other crises that we're facing as a country. And our health panel just spoke about health and climate, and we know mental health is a critical part of that conversation. So what are your experiences with this eco-grief, and why is it important for us to talk about it? I'll share the poll results as soon as I get them. Let's start with Leah.
Thank you, Annie. This is a really important question because we need to name that what I call the dark night of the green soul, the realization of what we've lost and what we stand to lose on this planet. And in the faith community, we have resources for this. We have scriptures, we have liturgies, we have rituals for naming this grief. We call it lamentation. But lamentation isn't just about wallowing in our sorrow. The theologian Walter Brueggemann says that there are three purposes for lamentation in Scripture. One is to name that something is a problem, like it's not just a happenstance that there are all of these things going on in terms of how people are suffering due to climate change. These things are not right. So that's the second thing, that we name these as moral and ethical sin. That's another word that we have in our vocabulary in the faith community, that we can say that it's not right. There's something systemically wrong that we need to address. But then the third stage is to say we need to do something. The lamentation compels us to act on this in order to address these underlying problems and build or rebuild the community so that we can live into the vision of justice and righteousness that many faith communities believe is God's vision for us. So that's why we have to name the lamentation in order to get to that next stage of action and response.
Thanks so much, Leah. John or Michael, do you want to share?
Go ahead, Michael.
Actually, I was going to toss it to you, John, and let you jump in first.
I'll say a few words.
Oh.
There's a passage in our sacred writings that reads, "The stones themselves shall cry out." And it's a way of saying that when those who are invited to speak on the Creator's behalf remain silent, the earth will not be. She will find her own voice. And this grief that we are experiencing now as a collective humanity isn't just a grief borne by human beings. The entire earth is suffering, and taking note of our collective silence in the face of that suffering. I'm not suggesting that the pandemic is the Earth's calculated way of saying, okay, this is your punishment, but it is the Earth's way of saying it cannot bear this weight alone. And as the pandemic has played out, as we have quarantined ourselves, as we drive fewer cars and fly fewer planes, we are seeing around the world the healing of an Earth that is crying out for its own life and its own justice, and asking once again to breathe clean air. We're seeing photographs of Beijing where 3-4 months ago, you couldn't see 2 blocks down the street because of the smog, and now you can see into the countryside surrounding it. We're seeing views from the Nepali villages that are seeing mountaintops that they haven't seen in decades. This is a grief borne by the earth itself, and the earth is crying out. The stones themselves will shout if we remain silent, and it will not bear this grief alone.
Wow. Michael, before we go to you, I just want to share what we're seeing here in the poll. So we have almost resounding, everyone is experiencing, who's participating in this conference today is experiencing some of this grief, and over almost 60% are responding that they are experiencing all of the items that we've listed here, with just those 3% of you on here who have been able to remain positive and hopeful. So we're so grateful for you. And also just in terms of engaging with the faith community, we're seeing a lot of people who are saying, I didn't realize this was something or a sector that I could engage with. So very interesting.
Yeah, I think that speaks to kind of to what we're talking about as well. And I think Dr. Leah hit on one of my favorite theologians, which is Walter Brueggemann. There's something else that Walter Brueggemann speaks on in his work. He talks about how we move from orientation to disorientation to reorientation. I think our old normal was our being oriented to the way things were. And we found out what COVID has highlighted for us, which is that our systems were terribly corrupt and broken. COVID has come along and disoriented us. Not just COVID, but the uprisings because of the brutality against Black bodies. We are also seeing the effects of the poverty being highlighted because of unemployment and because of of the economic downturn, which has been presented by COVID. All of these things contribute to disorienting us. Where we come in as faith leaders is we know this world, we know this disorientation, we know how to even counsel against it. And as we are reorienting, we also know what it looks like according to our sacred understandings of justice and equity, what it looks like according to our sacred understandings of diversity and inclusion. And so at this moment, it's important for us to become interdisciplinary and sit at the tables with doctors and sit at the tables with policy wonks and sit at the tables with those who are decision makers, such as our legislators and other things, because what we need to reorient to is a new normal that's not corrupt and that's not broken and that's not imbalanced, that doesn't reek of systemic racism and anti-Blackness. And where we come in as faith leaders is, I believe, we can help with that.
So I want to talk about just what you were referencing here and this imperative that we've been hearing throughout the conference about increasing ambition and action in this regard. And, so many faith traditions are truly leading on this right now. You all certainly reflect that. Our last Let's Talk Climate episode featured Rabbi Jenny Rosen, who is founding the new Dayenu Jewish organization that's working to catalyze increased ambition and action among the Jewish tradition. We have a wonderful youth speaker coming up on our youth panel today who's going to talk about organizing in the Muslim community through Green Muslims. But we also know, and several of our climate scholars are people of faith this year. But we also know that while many Americans are concerned about climate change, I think Rebecca referenced the statistic last session, there are still some with a range of beliefs, especially in the faith sector, ranging from apathy to denial, and many who are concerned but aren't activating themselves to take action. So I'm curious from your perspectives, how can faith communities catalyze more ambitious action at a regional and a local level? And specifically for those, again, in our audience who aren't people of faith, how can they partner with faith sector?
I'm eager to help answer that. However, I've got my president of my denomination on this panel with me, and I dare not speak about what a denomination can do when I've got my president of my denomination. So I'd rather toss it over to John and let him set the tone, and I can go from there.
Well, let's negotiate here, Michael. I'll talk about what a denomination can do if you can talk about what your local church can do.
So for me, it's really always about getting involved, whether it be through education, whether it be through advocacy, whether it be through ministering to encourage others to get involved. The reality is we all have to get involved, but let me be even more micro in that. And let me say from an individual standpoint, start talking. Things aren't right. Things aren't lining up to the way that things should be. Start talking. And it's important that we start talking to those who are closest to us, because those are the ones we have the most influence on. And so from an individual, from a very, very local standpoint, it's important that we start opening our mouths and talking. From a local church standpoint, it's important that we get involved, not just from a literal standpoint, not from a mental standpoint, not just from a theoretical standpoint, but start getting involved physically. And a way to do that is to support some of the people that are already doing the work. What would it look like for a church to partner with one of your local organizations that's already serving the community, to not only give them economic gain, but also give them capacity building as well, help them to get out in the streets and do what they're doing. So I think that's how we can get involved locally and individually. And now I'll give it back over to my negotiator.
I'm going to briefly talk about 4 strategies that we deploy collectively as a denomination. And at this level, what we're looking at is asking the question about identity. Who are we collectively as a people of faith? And then how can we utilize our collective agency for the common good? And these are some of the things that we've done through the years that all of us can do. In 1987, our Commission for Racial Justice wrote a landmark report entitled Toxic Waste and Racism, coining the phrase environmental racism and pointing out that much of the toxic waste that was being produced and dumped was being dumped in neighborhoods largely populated by people of color. And the cleanup of the earth intersected at that point with the active and ongoing investment in racism that has been a part of this culture. And in 1987, a denominational commission, the Commission for Racial Justice, did that study and wrote that report. And we've now updated it 2 more times since. We updated it in 2007 on the 20th anniversary and in 2017 on the 13th anniversary. Accompanying that was the first summit of people of color that in 1991 produced 17 principles for a just earth environment that is still relevant today. And that includes a call to vote. And that's the second thing that I want to talk about. Our denomination produces materials that we circulate at every level of our denomination, all the way down to the local church, called Our Faith, Our Vote. We don't choose candidates. We don't tell people how to vote. We simply ask them to identify their values and exercise their responsibility as citizens. And as Michael said, talking to policy wonks and legislators matters, because right now they are one of the single greatest impediments to this earth's healing. And the only way that changes is when we vote our values. A third thing, we have I have somebody in my office of the president who serves as my ambassador for climate justice. And he's written a book, Jim Antal is his name, called Climate Church, Climate World. And his argument is that the church, which has a live audience in front of it every Sunday, should begin to treat the care of the earth the way abolitionist preachers treated their pulpit in the time of slavery, and should remind people of the urgency of this as a matter of faith, and use the power of their voice in the pulpit, if need be, Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, until the earth is made whole. And we should not undervalue nor underestimate the impact that can be created when worship leaders use their voice, as Michael said, use their voice as an agent calling people of faith to justice. And then the final thing I'll mention is, we wrote a mission statement about 6 years ago, in which the vision that we spoke to ourselves was a just world for all. And in order to embody and enact that, we asked our church to embrace 3 great loves: the love of children, the love of neighbor, and the love of creation. We called our entire denomination to an awareness that if we don't care for the earth right now, then we have lost our orientation and compass as a people of faith. We are stewards. And so this is the United Church of Christ trying to remind ourselves over and over and over again of the urgency of this matter, and utilizing the collective agency of people of faith to make a difference.
I'm really encouraged to hear that, Reverend Dorhauer, because in the work that I've been doing for the past 15 years, I'm seeing the grassroots of religious environmental activism really sprout up. I mean, people are putting solar panels on their roofs. They're advocating for environmental protections. They are encouraging their denominations to divest the denomination's investment portfolio from fossil fuels. All kinds of things, addressing eco-racism. But what we need is not just the grassroots, but we need the treetops. We need the denominational leaders who have the vantage point, who can see the larger landscape and issue a clarion call for denominations to respond, to do this work. So speaking of Jim Antal, in the chapter that he wrote for Rooted and Rising, a book that I helped co-edit with Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, he said that he'd like to see denominational leaders and pastors dedicate 25% of their time and their resources to addressing climate change.
Which he did.
Exactly. So I think we need more metrics like that. So let's say your denomination or your region or whatever is in your jurisdiction, if you're a denominational leader, let's say you're going to take this on. Well, you could begin with what I would call the creation tithe, TITHE, where you're going to start with 10%. That's the biblically authorized amount. So you can say, okay, tithe your drive 10% less. Tithe your land, take 10% of the land and plant trees on it, or plant a butterfly garden or a rain garden. And then you can do the double tithe, right? So that gets you to 20%. So these are the big, large scale efforts. Putting in the solar panels, or the or taking 20% of your church meals and not having meat in them, right? Or taking 20% of your Christian education time and dedicating it to learning about environmental racism and how to advocate. And then the third stage would be strive for 5%, that last 5%, to get you to the 25% goal. So let's say 5% of the church signs up for a clean energy co-op. And, Blessed Tomorrow and ecoAmerica have great resources for doing this sort of thing. Or dedicating 5% of the benevolent fund to a church in an under-resourced area to help them meet their climate ambition goal. If we have these metrics and we have some creative visioning and commitment, there are so many ways that we can enact this climate ambition in our ministries and in our denominations.
So helpful to give some really concrete pieces of advice here. And we're receiving some questions in the chat. So again, check out the right-hand side, ask your questions as we go along. But the next question I prepared for you really aligns with something that's coming up in the chat, which is, when people who are participating today, they're not people of faith, they don't necessarily feel like they have the skills or expertise to engage with the faith sector. They want to know what they can do and how they can partner. And, we use disaster relief and disaster response as a great example of things that are happening on the ground in partnership with local organizations and government organizations all the time. And so I'm curious if you can share, some examples of, as we experience more intense and more frequent natural disasters, how are you at a local level or at a denominational level responding, and how can folks partner and also start to address some of the inequities that we see in disaster relief and response?
So I think that it's a dangerous zone for us to go in. And I've always felt this way and continue to preach against it, really. For churches to feel like they've got to be in the lead to do whatever, when there are already organizations that are doing the work. So we will start up a whole nother disaster relief program instead of just partnering with the local program that's already doing it. And most of the times, to be honest with you, from what I've seen thus far in this work, we go in and we don't really know what we're doing. And so, we just bypass the expertise and overlook the expertise, those that have been doing it and know what they're doing, just to try to start something new. And I just feel like we don't have to do that. There are already disaster relief efforts that are going on. Again, what would it look like for our congregations? What would it look like for our churches to partner with those that are already doing the work? I tell you what it would look like. It would look like strengthening those other organizations, one. But because of the stance that we take, which is that moral stance, we also get to hold them accountable. And one of the things with disaster recovery, disaster relief efforts, what we found out through Katrina, what we found out through the other disasters that we've had to deal with, there's systemic racism that is throughout. And as a result, those, not just systemic racism, but you also have LGBT that are left out of the conversation. And so certain communities aren't being seen about in a balanced way. What we can do is become a governing for that. And we can ensure that people are balanced in their relief efforts. And we're not part of favoring one over the other. But the only way you can do that is to be actively involved, not just give money. I want to reiterate that point. Listen, I need your money because that's how I live. However, I don't want your money if your money means you just patronizing me and it's not going to be transformational. If you're going to give, allow for it to be transformational. So therefore, you don't just give money, but give your time as well. It's time, talent, and treasure. And so give it all, and that way it goes better. And believe it or not, we learn more. That's real ministry.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to share some thoughts on this particular question?
Yeah, the metaphor I like to use is that in terms of the multi-faith dimension of this work, I like to envision what I call the ecoethical arc, that we are coming together to find common ground, common water, common air, and the values that transcend our race, ethnicity, culture, religion, sexual orientation, all of that. We must have a livable planet in order for any of those diversities to exist. So I find a lot in common with my Muslim siblings and my Unitarian siblings and my Jewish siblings, that when we are working on caring for creation, protecting it, preserving it, caring for what Jesus called the least of these, those who have been marginalized, who have the least amount of power and no voice and no agency, when we come alongside them, when we accompany them as they are finding their voice, as they are finding their empowerment in their communities, the church can buttress those efforts. I think that's what Reverend Malcom is talking about, that we can be a support with this because we've been doing this for thousands of years. We've got these resources. We've got the know-how. We've got a history of this. So if we can all pull together on this, we can make incredible change for the good. So I would encourage people who are not religious to reach out to your local community, whatever the mosque, the church, the synagogue, the temple, whatever it is. Find ways to partner with each other, because as a bishop of mine once said, we can do so much more together than we can ever do alone.
Amen. I wanted to ask another question along these lines. So, I mean, we've talked. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Before you do that, Anita, let me say, Dr. Leah, I was actually thinking the opposite. Instead of people reaching out to the church or to congregations, houses of worship, why not have them reach out to other people?
Oh, absolutely.
You
Absolutely.
know,
Yeah, like that, and there are organizations that are Interfaith Power and Light,
right,
Green Faith,
right,
Poor People's Campaign.
right.
I mean, the idea is not that, I mean, it's a two-way street, and I should have said that, so thank you for correcting me. But it's not just, oh, you have to come to us. What I wanted to encourage is to say, the faith community sometimes gets a bad rap, that we are anti-science, that we are anti-progressive values, and that's not always the case. So but that was more of an invitation to say, don't just write all religious people off. just because some people are like that. So it's okay to reach out to those with whom you know you share those values. And we need to be out there too. We need to be in the streets, in the fields, at the protests, at the fracking sites, all of those places where justice is happening. Clergy, people of faith need to be there too.
You teed up perfectly my question, which was really just, we're talking about engagement, but we also are talking about action, and we also need to talk about advocacy. And Reverend Dorhauer referenced the importance of voting, and you know, despite what some may think, get out the vote and voter engagement is a huge part of a lot of faith traditions, history and values and priorities this year. And so I'm curious if you can share, you know, how do you think we can get more clergy, more congregants actively engaged, you know, across faith traditions in advocacy, and particularly this year in thinking about voter engagement? And what are some programs, some concrete examples that you might have?
Just a few quick thoughts. In terms of advocacy, one of the things that I've seen work very well in local congregations is identify an individual, or if you want a small team of individuals, who will offer as their responsibility to the faith community that they will track pieces of legislation that are important to the preservation of the planet, and that they will produce, when folk come together in worship, letters that can be signed, already there on the table, and information about who their representatives are and how you can contact them by email or phone. And when one person or just a small team of people take that responsibility on, it's an amazing thing that happens. And all people then have to do is, as they leave the sanctuary, just sign their name, and that person will take care of it, will mail it. They can also do the same thing with an email list. A second thing, community gardens. Churches and congregations of all faith varieties have land that often sits unused or unutilized, and many of them are converting that now to community gardens, and that's something the entire community can get invested in. And while legislative advocacy is one thing, actual earth advocacy is another thing, and community gardens make a big difference in terms of greening the environment and bringing a community together and producing food at low cost that can sometimes go to feed banks or other food banks or other places like that. And then one more quick thing. Imagine if every rooftop of every house of worship in the country decided to convert to solar panels. These are expensive items. I was in Phoenix when Temple Solel and Rabbi John Leonard poured a lot of money to cover their parking lot and their rooftop in solar panels, and it was a heavy investment for them. But imagine the purchasing scale we could produce if congregations of all faiths came together and made that collective commitment to convert their parking space and their rooftop space to solar. We would all lower our costs. We would change the way people think about the faith community's investment in this advocacy work, and the difference that we would make in all of our communities would be immediate.
Modeling is so important. And we know that solar costs are going down, and that there are opportunities and grant programs occasionally that can help congregations think about this. Interfaith Power and Light has a program as well. Michael, what would you like to say to this?
Dr. Dorhauer and Anita as well. One of the things that you have to be mindful of as well is that in the South, we don't have the same luxury of just putting solar on our rooftops because of legislation.
Phoenix was like that.
Yeah, in Alabama in particular, but I'm just giving this example, but I know this is, throughout the South. They have, the utilities have actively gone against putting solar on homes. And so they passed a law or a tax that if you have solar, you have to pay $5 additional per kilowatt per month. They say it's for storage, But if you ever had to use it, they charge you for that as well. So in all actuality, it comes across as a bully tax that they're charging you just for not using their services. So this in turn, if you decide that you're going to put solar on your house of worship anyway, then you're taking an even bolder step, because now you can say, well, we put solar on our house of worship. Why aren't you allowing this for our congregation as well, our congregants as well?
But also, Michael, if every house of worship, because you're talking about a law, if every house of worship took this up as an advocacy issue, they'd change that law.
Absolutely. And I will say that the People's Justice Council is right now starting a campaign for the South called Energizing the South for Energy Justice, where we really want to actively get congregations and houses of worship involved to fight for this, because this is an economic upward mobility mechanism that will help a lot of people that are in poverty right now, because in the South, energy burdens are just horrendous. And you have vulnerable families that are paying 8 to 10% of their income goes to utilities. So when you look at the cycle of poverty, that's only just keeping them in poverty. But if they were able to do retrofits on their homes, if they were able to do solar, they can have save 20 to 30% of their income, their yearly income. Do you understand what that would do when it comes down to upward economic mobility? But I think that is the issue, and that's what we're trying to go against, or what the utilities are going against.
So this is what you're illustrating here, is that the ecological and the economic are completely intrinsically linked. And that is where the justice comes in. You know, we don't just do this because it's going to save money. We do this because it is a theological, moral, and ethical imperative. You know, if God created the world and called it good, as we believe, if we think of the Holy Spirit as moving and breathing through the air on this planet and the air that we breathe, if Jesus calls for justice for the least of these, then our efforts towards this, it is a faith response to become involved with creation care issues. So I think that we have an opportunity here to be relevant in a way that the church in some ways is not. That we sometimes we think, well, it's just our little bubble, and as long as I'm saved, then it's all, you know, we can just let the earth go to pot and we don't care as long as I'm going to be with Jesus in the end. No, we are commanded to care for the garden. That's where God put the first humans and gave them the command to care for this earth. And so our response is a faith response. So that's what I'd love to see more of from the faith community as well.
Beautiful. And I think really gets at some of the questions that, again, are coming in through the chat function about, you know, how do we talk about this with certain folks of faith who may not be on board or who may not be leading. And I just want to point out some research that ecoAmerica did that shows that almost 75% of Americans across the board are concerned about climate change. But when we ask them if they think other people are concerned, that number goes down to just over 50%. And so we really need to give people permission to talk about this and not make assumptions that just because they may ascribe to a certain faith tradition that automatically means that they may not believe that climate change is real, or that we have a responsibility to do something about it, and that they should be activated to do that. So we're almost at time. I want to ask a quick lightning round question and then we'll wrap up here. So just if you all could share in just 1 or 2 sentences, what gives you hope right now? We started off talking about the sense that many of us on this call, almost everyone on this conference today, are experiencing some level of grief and anxiety. What gives you hope and helps you build personal resilience? And most importantly, what advice would you give them in becoming better ambassadors of hope within their own network? Reverend Malcom?
Yeah, I think what actually gives me hope right now is the youth, is the generations that's coming up behind me. I think that they've looked at our past history and declared that they don't want that, and they've set out to really shape something anew. And in their shaping something anew, they're not asking for our permission. And as somebody who is just rebellious in heart and mind, that just speaks directly to me, and I'm loving it. And so I encourage them to get out and pump their fist and make some noise. What can we do? Help them, encourage them, bless them. What else can we do? Again, it's not enough for me just to be a preacher and me knowing theologically this, that, and the third. I've also got to be involved with other disciplines as well, and allow for my influence to be in those disciplines as well as those disciplines be in me. And that's what I would say right now.
Or Dorhauer?
What gives me hope is beauty and resilience. I don't care how bad it gets. I can see God's beauty and God's handiwork in everything. And the earth is the most resilient, adaptive organism I have ever met. And it will not be silenced, or nor will its life ultimately be taken by us. It will adapt. And those two things give me hope. And if there's anything I would recommend that people do, it's notice beauty. I don't care how bad it gets, how hard it gets. Do not fail to notice beauty. It inspires joy and hope.
Leah?
In the Christian tradition, we talk about the resurrection of Jesus, who was crucified for all of these kinds of things that we've been talking about, injustices. And yet on the third day, he rose. And the women who showed up at his tomb on Easter morning, they showed up expecting death, but they were surprised with life. And so what gives me hope is a God who surprises us with new life in ways that we can't even anticipate, and comes to us in a resurrected Lord who still has the scars, and earth is going to have scars. But this resilience that you're talking about, Reverend Dorhauer, that earth has that resilience. And so I would encourage people, show up with the women at the tomb, be present for the pain, and trust in the goodness of the divine that wants our restoration and fullness of life.
We have to end there. Thank you so much to everyone. It's been a wonderful panel. I hope this was both inspiring and action driving for our audience. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jennifer Roberts, Director of ecoAmerica's Path to Positive Communities program and former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, to facilitate a discussion with local communities next.